This is episode 402 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Daniel Suhr. He is an attorney with the Liberty Justice Center, and he is a speaker at an event we're having on Wednesday, May 5th. If you're watching this online, as opposed to the podcast feed, come on out and join us on May 5th for our luncheon. You can find out more about that at the foundation's website. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, and welcome to New Mexico, Daniel.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, before we get too far into policies and law and all those kinds of things.
The good stuff.
Talk about yourself, where you're from, a little bit about the Liberty Justice Center. Obviously, the most known case they litigated was the Janus decision, but they've also litigated on other issues. So why don't you talk about them as well, the organization?
Yeah, well, thanks for getting the introduction right. I have to tell you, I was on a radio program the other day, and I was introduced as Daniel Suhr from the Liberal Justice Center.
Oh,
just to be clear, that's not right. I was on a different program, and I was introduced as Daniel Suhr from the Liberty Justice League. So
that's pretty cool.
At least a little bit. I got an 8-year-old and 11-year-old boys. So the idea their dad was part of the Justice League, I got to wear a cape home. But obviously it's the Liberty Justice Center. Sometimes I joke at the Liberty Justice Center, we love liberty, we love justice. We are not very much in the center. Our job is to be fighters for freedom on the front lines of what we see as this important battle to protect the Constitution and the rule of law that's happening in our courts right now.
Yeah, so you're a nonprofit legal foundation.
So in many ways, think of us like the ACLU, only on the right. That our job is to protect people's constitutional rights and liberties. Those have been under attack, as we'll talk about in the coming hour. But really, even outside the COVID context, pre-COVID, there have been so many important areas where freedom is under attack. We see that in free speech, the case we work on together, Paul. We see that in the Janus case that you mentioned, one of the really great landmarks in moving forward with protecting people's free speech rights is saying that in order to hold a job, you don't have to pay money to a union you don't agree with or believe in, that there had been millions of Americans across the country that is a condition of holding a government job were forced to subsidize unions that would use that money for political purposes. And we were the people who brought the case where the Supreme Court finally said enough is enough. And we're not going to infringe on people's free association rights. And really today, I think the biggest threat we have for free speech, besides the ones we'll talk about, is cancel culture. Mm-hmm. That a lot of what's happening in our culture broadly is this idea of cancel culture, that we're going to target people who disagree with us on political issues, and we're going to destroy their business, we're going to destroy their career, we're going to go after their kids, we're going to embarrass them in restaurants. Like this is the world we live in right now. And so I represent a number of what we would call victims of cancel culture who spoke up in behalf of traditional American values or just spoke up with their own views and found their jobs on the line or otherwise. And so we're fighting back in court to vindicate those fundamental free speech protections that exist for all of us, even at a time when what you say might not be popular on the left side of the political spectrum.
Nice. Well, again, you are somebody who represents the Rio Grande Foundation on a free speech case. And why don't you just tell folks about that case briefly and give an update as to where things stand, because the wheels of justice are not known for being particularly swift.
Yeah, we are churning away slowly. So actually, this is a chance to be back on the podcast. If I remember correctly, we talked about this last time. So one aspect of cancel culture is the way in which people are being persecuted for their charitable or nonprofit giving. That we have seen the weaponization of publicly disclosed records of people's charitable and nonprofit giving as a way to persecute people. So the best example that you might be familiar with from a few years ago was the CEO of Mozilla, the internet browser company, was driven out of Silicon Valley and driven out of his job because activists found out that years before he had been with the majority of the people of California in supporting Proposition 8, and he had done so with a financial gift, a small financial gift, really. And that was just one of several examples of people who supported Prop 8 who were punished by liberal activists for supporting that cause.
Proposition 8 was regarding gay marriage and specifically saying that marriage is one man and one woman, which
yep.
was very much the mainstream opinion, even as recently as the first Barack Obama term.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, Proposition 8 passed, right? These people supported
In California.
In California, these people supported the winning side of that question. And so those are just examples of how we've seen publicly disclosed campaign data weaponized to persecute people. It's a tool for the bullies. And unfortunately, in New Mexico, there was a law passed a few years ago that expanded campaign disclosure to cover groups that aren't actually campaigning, groups that are just providing citizens with issue information, right? So you're not saying vote for or vote against a particular candidate. You're not saying support or oppose. We're just saying, this is how this state senator of yours voted on taxes, right? Or some other salient issue. And as part of the left's incessant drive to expose what people are doing and destroy people's privacy in the public square, they passed this bill that required groups like Rio Grande Foundation to disclose to a government bureaucrat who their supporters are, and that information is then posted on the internet for the world to see. So all of a sudden you support a charitable group like Rio Grande, and that charitable giving is now on the internet. And so for a lot of folks who support causes on the right or the left, right? Not just the foundation, but the Sierra Club or Planned Parenthood, like groups in general that operate adjacent to politics but aren't actually candidates in campaigns, they deserve to have their privacy. That's the principle we're seeking to vindicate. But as you say, the case has been going for a while. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but we're not going to give up in our fight to make sure that Rio Grande and all of its supporters and really people across New Mexico have free speech rights without having to sacrifice their privacy.
Now, before we get on to the topic you're speaking about, the Supreme Court has very much been in the news here in the last 48 hours.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say that the court is having a cancellation attempt, but definitely the leaking of a proposed or draft opinion is very much unprecedented in the way that it was done. I guess I read some news reports saying that there was some leaks about the original Roe v. Wade decision, but this seems explicitly designed probably by one of the clerks for one of the liberal justices to ramp up some form of harassment and pushback against the Supreme Court members who support repealing Roe v. Wade and kicking abortion policy back to the states. So just talk about the importance and anything about this issue that maybe non-attorneys, not professionals involved in the system, might not understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So for starters, I was a law clerk for a judge on the Court of Appeals, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Chicago. And as part of being a law clerk, one of the first things I had to do was sign a confidentiality agreement. I mean, that is just so ingrained. Sometimes we refer to a judge's chambers as being like a monastery. It's sort of a very closed, protected environment where you've just got the judge and their law clerks. And in that kind of environment, trust is essential. And so what we see in this leak is incredibly unfortunate. We've seen so many attacks from the left leveled on conservatives for quote unquote undermining traditional democratic norms, right? I mean, how many times during the Trump administration did we hear that the norms or standards of our political discourse were being destroyed by President Trump? I don't think anything President Trump did compares to leaking a confidential Supreme Court draft. But unfortunately, this is part of a longstanding campaign, perhaps on the part of left-wing groups to pressure the court, right? This isn't about the law. This isn't about the Constitution, the text, the traditional tools of legal principle. This is about leveraging cultural power, right? This is about intimidation. That it's an effort to undermine the court's independence, just like packing the court or threats to pack the court are an attack on the court's independence, just like these manufactured attacks on Clarence Thomas and Mrs. Thomas, right? I mean, there are a number of judges who are married to people in politics. The Democratic governor of Pennsylvania was married to a federal court of appeals judge for years. The U.S. senator from Delaware was married to a court of appeals judge. Like, this is frequently happens that people in politics and people in law are these kind of power couples. But it's only when it's Clarence and Ginny Thomas that all of a sudden democracy is on the line and being destroyed, right? And why is that? Well, it's because there's this sustained effort on the left to intimidate and undermine the independence of the court and try to use the tools of cultural power, the news media, in order to force a result that's not based on law, but it's based on politics. And the whole point of the court is that we have the rule, not, to quote the Federalist Papers, it's the rule of law and not of men. And that's the principle I think the justices will vindicate when they decide this case based on the law and not give in to the bullies.
Yeah, and we're jumping to conclusions, but it definitely seems that the side that had the most to gain from this kind of leak would be the left. It would be shocking based on both their broader philosophies, but also the potential for gain or loss. It seems hard to believe that one of the conservative justices would have done this, or that would have happened by accident or something like that. This is it's just a matter of time. We'll see. And what, if any, ramifications could this have for somebody? Obviously, their legal career could be ended, but they could be a cause celeb, kind of turning it into the.
I'm sure there's a tenured professorship at a very nice law school
Right.
waiting for them.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're right, Paul. We don't have all the facts, and so we should be hesitant to jump to conclusions. That said, regardless of what motivated the leak, I think the fact of the leak is really problematic, but it shouldn't distract us from the fact that the draft is authentic, and it's a really great opinion. Like, kudos to Justice Alito. If this is the opinion we get on June 30th or something very close to this, it is a thoughtful, thorough, scholarly opinion. And it needed to be, right? Mm-hmm. Overturning precedent is always a big lift. And we should want it to be. Again, if we're a country that believes in the rule of law and not of men, we should be skeptical when there's an assertion made that some prior legal decision needs to be overturned, right? There should be a healthy respect for what came before. But as one of my mentors in the law said, when you become a judge, you take an oath to the Constitution, not to the Warren Court, right? This idea that in the past, the Warren Court, the Supreme Court that we had in the probably 50 years ago, was just heavily activist. Mm-hmm. And they did a whole bunch of really activist things. And for us as conservatives, it shouldn't be our responsibility to conserve and protect what a previous generation of activist liberals did, right? Our job should be to conserve and protect what the framers did, what the founders of this country did, what the people who wrote the 14th Amendment coming off the Civil War did. That's what we take an oath to. And so I think it's entirely appropriate for judges to return us to that original text, to return us to those first principles. And Justice Alito's opinion, as we've seen in draft form, is a very thoughtful, thorough, very scholarly, defensible opinion. It is not a raw exercise of willpower. It is reaching the right legal answer using the right legal tools.
All right. So thank you for that. That's a very timely topic, and something that, the Supreme Court is quite arcane, even by American political standards, just the way it operates and the standards that it operates to. I think it's in many ways a very straightforward entity and has a lot of obvious, very important impacts on our day-to-day lives, but it's something that people don't always understand why something is a big deal with the Supreme Court.
Well, one of the reasons this opinion is going to be such a big deal is that it will return this issue to the states, and I think you're right. In fact, one of the ironies of this right now is that the Democratic Party, which in so many other circumstances have been saying democracy is under attack, right? Like their theme for the 2022 elections seems to be we have to save democracy, and all of this from coming off of President Trump's term, and yet on the question of returning abortion to the democratic process, they are just totally against it, and I think what's more, it's actually a little bit overly optimistic to say that we're going to return abortion to the voters. We're just going to shift what courts these fights happen in. That state constitutions provide an independent source of rights for the people of each individual state, and state Supreme Courts have the right to interpret their own state constitutions separate and independent from the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So I don't think the abortion question is going to end with this decision in court. Instead, it is just going to fracture. And it's not going to fracture out into 50 different state legislatures. It's going to really fracture out into 50 different state Supreme Courts. That there will be there already is, in fact, an effort on the part of the left in Michigan right now, in Wyoming, in Iowa, it sounds like, to try to get state Supreme Courts to find state constitutional rights to abortion. I'm sure that will be coming into Mexico too.
So you're before we leave that topic, you brought up the idea of legislatures acting, and New Mexico's already has. They've already enshrined a very kind of permissive scheme in place when it comes to abortion in anticipation of a decision like this. I haven't heard any court challenges for that. Are you thinking that the court challenges will all work in the opposite direction? Because I can definitely see Texas and Utah and Oklahoma having much different legal interpretations and also legislative decisions. So you think it'll go to the state courts eventually?
Yeah, I think the real problem will arise in red states that have blue state Supreme Courts. So
Right.
there are a fair number of blue states that are just going to, like California, New York. These states are just going to adopt permissive abortion laws that are going to reflect their population, and what their state Supreme Court does isn't really going to matter. Similarly, I think you're right that in a lot of red states, they're going to adopt abortion restrictions, and either their state Supreme Courts will uphold them, and just kind of reflect the population. The problem, I think, is especially in the Midwest, where there are a number of state Supreme Courts that have been chosen often through what we call the Missouri Plan, which is this method of judicial selection that empowers state bar insiders to pick judges. And that in those Missouri Plan states, like Iowa, like Wyoming, like Idaho, Nebraska, there are deeply socially conservative communities, and yet they have predominantly blue state Supreme Courts. And really, it hasn't mattered a lot outside some isolated business cases. That's never been a problem. But we saw it in the mid-2000s where several of those state Supreme Courts, especially Iowa, imposed gay marriage on a very socially conservative state. And voters were just not having it. And I think we're going to see a repeat of that in probably another dozen states or so after this decision on abortion comes down.
Interesting. All right. Well,
there's your fun fact for the day.
Yeah. The way we could do a whole podcast on judicial elections and the way they could or should best operate. I mean, people certainly complain, mostly again on the left, about the Supreme Court lifetime appointments and how that process works. But I can say that the judicial election process here in New Mexico is not so great, and it sounds like we're not alone in that regard. But Let's talk about the subject that you're actually here in New Mexico.
Let me just say quick.
Oh, go ahead.
The
Sure.
answer on how
I knew
we
I
pick
wasn't going to
judges-
get out of that without.
No, you're not. Here's the answer on how we pick judges.
Okay.
If the judges don't use all the power, then nobody will care. Right. The only reason we have a ton
All
of
the power.
Yeah, the only reason that we have a ton of money spent on judicial elections is because judges make all the important decisions in our society. Right?
Right.
If judges just actually administered the law rather than making huge social policy, we wouldn't spend a ton of time and effort fighting over who the judges are.
Well, good luck with that one. There's a few other Don Quixote-esque projects out there, and I think that is right up on the list. But yeah, I would just like a more in New Mexico. The big issue I have is that judicial candidates can't really run as party elected officials or explain what they want to do on various topics. So you just get, a face with a name, and you kind of hear through the grapevine whether they're liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. But to the average person, I mean, that's me keeping track of these things, let alone the average person who doesn't really have a darn clue. So anyway, all right, we're going to get into the COVID fun and excitement. And this is important not just because of looking back at COVID and what happened to so many people in so many parts of our society. It's obviously important because once politicians find a nice new shiny toy to play with that gives them unlock all the power, they tend to want to continue to unlock the power. And I think it's fair to say that an environmental crisis could result in some kind of emergency declaration that aggregates a lot of the power in our state or in other states to a governor. So just give us the elevator speech about the issue, and then we can kind of unpack it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I think, scary to say, but the restrictions on liberty that we saw during the COVID era are the most substantial restrictions on individual liberty that we have seen in this country, at least since World War II. Right? I think it's worth just taking a step back for 2 years. Like here the three of us are sitting in this studio. This wouldn't have been possible 2 years ago. In fact, we wouldn't even be out of our houses 2 years ago. Work was canceled, under these stay-at-home or shelter-in-place orders. Workplaces were closed, schools were closed, churches were closed, jury trials were closed. I mean, for a period of several months, basically all individual liberty was suspended. So many of our constitutional rights, the freedom to gather and the freedom to support candidates, I mean, like these basic foundational building blocks of our constitutional system, they were all suspended. And courts were generally okay with it, right? Courts upheld the suspension of our basic constitutional freedoms. And so the starting point for any conversation, I think, on COVID just has to be putting in historical context how incredible the assertion of government power was that, really, I think since at least World War II, maybe, and the internment of Japanese Americans, it's hard to find other examples where government has wielded such substantial power over the lives of individual people. We gave up a lot of liberty for a long time. And as you say, Paul, when the government takes our liberty, it is reluctant to give it back. And it's only because I think the American people have been standing up and taking it back for themselves that we finally see a restoration of our basic freedoms.
Now, Wisconsin is one of the states that saw some litigation on this. A handful of states did. And one of the, as an aside, no offense to the lawyers and judges out there, but it was pretty shocking how deferential judges here in New Mexico, including federal, so not just people put there by Democrat politicians or liberal voters, but all over the country, there was a lot of deference expressed by judges. But Wisconsin was one of the states early-ish on where a judge stood up. And I know Liberty Justice Center has been involved in some of these suits. I don't remember if that was one of them, but
Yeah,
it's
Wisconsin's a great example, I think, of two things. One, it's the importance of insisting on structural protection for liberty. Right, the Bill of Rights is wonderful, but the Bill of Rights is only real because we have judges who enforce it and executives and legislators who respect what the judges say it means. Right, Justice Scalia had this wonderful line he'd often use that the Bill of Rights and the Soviet Constitution is longer and more detailed than the American Bill of Rights. But it doesn't matter, right? You can still the KGB show up at your house and haul you off to secret prison because there's no structure to preserve and protect liberty, right? So the Wisconsin case was really a structure case. It was about saying, okay to the governor, the law allows you 30 days to exercise emergency powers, but after 30 days, you have to get legislative authorization. So we're not saying the stay-at-home order is good or bad. We're not saying COVID restrictions are meaningful or important. We're just saying under the law, the governor can't do it unilaterally. You also have to get the legislature to adopt it with you.
so that was on the books in Wisconsin,
That was the law in the
and
books. 30 days.
the governor was ignoring that.
And the governor was trying to ignore it. And so the legislature had to go to court
Wow.
and essentially say, no, like you can't govern by these administrative orders from the Secretary of Health Services. You have to actually go through the legislative process after the emergency window expires. You can't just stack 30 days and 30 days and 30 days and 30 days when, clearly the way the law works is after the 30 days, after the immediate response, you have to have legislative approval to continue with these things in place. I think the second lesson to take from the Wisconsin example is just to compare it to Illinois, right? I mean, here you have two states right next to each other. And in Wisconsin, the pandemic essentially ended in some sense within months. I think that court decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court decision was like May after March, right? So by May in Wisconsin. In Illinois, the pandemic restrictions continue for 2 years, right? I mean, it was only a couple of months ago you had to show your vaccine passport to go out to dinner in Chicago. Restaurants were closed, right? Businesses were closed. And yet there was not meaningful differences in the population. There was not meaningful differences in the cases or these things, right? It just showed that a lot of what motivated and sustained the lockdowns was politics and not medical science, because Wisconsin was able to return to pretty close to normalcy and not have a huge difference in comparison to Illinois, which was adopting all these lockdown policies and yet not seeing a substantial difference in the numbers.
Yeah, we're still under a emergency health order in New Mexico. It doesn't have many specific rules attached to it. I suspect there may be a financial incentive with the federal government to somehow fund various things. New Mexico politicians, this is especially true for Democrats. Alas, it's too true for many Republicans. They have like it's their superpower is weaseling more federal dollars out of Washington, D.C. It's kind of a hobby among New Mexico politicians, especially. And I can't confirm 100%, but it just seems like this governor has continued to renew those emergency orders.
You're totally right to point to federal funding. I mean, if I'm a blue state governor, like, why wouldn't I want to continue this pandemic in some sense, right? That I have incredible control through executive orders. I have a completely contented state workforce that's all working from home. And the legislature is generally much more compliant because I can just govern through executive order if I want to. And I'm getting buckets of federal cash from Washington, D.C. And I think one of the real things we should be concerned about as taxpayers is that we have grown government with all this one-time artificial inflation of federal dollars going into budgets. And now as we come out of the pandemic and these as the federal dollars recede, states are going to be under pressure to replace those federal dollars with state dollars, and that's going to have to come from state taxpayers.
Yeah. So, what can be done? I mean, we've kind of more or less moved past COVID. Things could obviously wind up back into some kind of restrictions if we see an uptick in cases. I mean, Philadelphia enacted a brief ban, a mask mandate. I mean, not a ban, and then pulled back on that. And the difficult thing is that if you scare the population enough, you can literally get away with anything. And it does reference back to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's anti-democratic. Well, we don't do everything in this country democratically because democracy can be manipulated and used in some very troubling ways. So, all that in mind, is there some way to prepare legal and other institutions for pandemic 2.0 or the environmental crisis to come?
Yeah, great question. And I think a couple important points. One, the gap between where the American people are at in their trust of public health institutions and where those public health institutions want to be is entirely the fault of public health institutions, right? I think the American people were really good sports during this pandemic. Again, the government told us to stay home, told us to keep our kids home, told us not to make money, told us not to show up to work, and we did it for months. Like, the American people were really good sports, and we lived with it. And yet then, we look around and we see Democratic politicians going to the Super Bowl and not wearing masks. We see Lollapalooza in Chicago the day before the mask mandate and the gatherings ban in
and
Chicago.
The George Floyd rallies.
The George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter marches, right? People saw the ways in which politics determined whether or not you had to comply. And I think that just incredibly undermines the credibility. The second thing that undermined the credibility was just the way in which they kept shifting the answer on the science. That initially masks weren't going to work, and then they were. That initially the vaccines were going to keep us safe, and then they didn't stop the spread. That we've just heard these constantly evolving explanations from Dr. Fauci and others that are just not reconcilable with one another. And then the ways in which so much of the timing of these public health decisions seems tied to politics, right? The fact that apparently the pandemic ended the same day as the President Biden's State of the Union, right? Just when the polling numbers needed to start really turning around. And so as much as I am sympathetic to the fact that we may have another pandemic in the future and we need robust public health institutions to help get us through those times, the credibility gap that Fauci and friends have right now, I think, is entirely of their own making. I think the second half of your question is really pointing to the future, and it's a great question because the claim for power on the part of the government, you mentioned the environmental example, but we could think of others, right? If OSHA, for instance, can impose a vaccine mandate to keep us safe at work, what would prevent OSHA from saying, we're not going to allow concealed carry of firearms at work, even if you have a permit or even if you're a state with constitutional carry, because in order to reduce workplace violence, we're going to have a policy of a federal rule of no firearms at work, right? Or OSHA saying, we're just going to ban soft drink vending machines at work, right? Like, we know that the left hates, you Paul of all people, right? Know that the left hates sugary soft drinks, right? If OSHA can say, to keep you safe at work, we're going to have a vaccine mandate, what's to stop OSHA from saying we're going to have a no sugary soft drinks at work, no vending machines mandate? Like, they could absolutely make those kind of claims and have some authority to do it unless and until we push back and eventually courts stop it. And thankfully the court stopped the OSHA mandate. And I think it did so in a way that relies on what we lawyers call the major questions doctrine, which actually means what it says, right? It's not hiding the ball. It's saying, if this is a major question, if we're making major federal policy decisions, our default assumption should be that Congress and not unelected bureaucrats makes those kinds of decisions. And so my hope is the precedent that we've been laying down in the last year that said these major policy questions on something as big as a nationwide mandate like a vaccine mandate have to be made by Congress. Then in the future, if another administration tried to use this to fight climate change or an epidemic of gun violence, right, as a quote unquote public health crisis, that we've got legal tools and precedent in place to cabin that and make sure that it's really Congress making those decisions in the first instance.
All right. Well, any final words? Liberty Justice Center. You can look up Daniel Suhr. That's Suhr. Any last words before we leave it there?
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. And you can follow us on Twitter at LJ Center or libertyjusticecenter.org. But really just thankful to Rio Grande and the fight that you guys are keeping up here in New Mexico. Paul, it's a real joy for me to be able to go out across the country and just see in every state, like the freedom movement is thriving, that we're all part of this kind of common network, that we're all on the front lines of the fight for freedom. Maybe it's in a state legislature, maybe it's in the courts, but really the only way that freedom survives, maybe one of the unexpected lessons of the pandemic, is that freedom only survives when the American people are willing to stand up and defend it. That the government will grow, the government will take our liberty, the government will take our tax money, and I as a lawyer can only do so much. It's only when I have a client, right? It's only when there's somebody who's willing to put their name on a lawsuit and go to court and say my rights are being violated and I'm sick of it, that we're able to make progress. And thankfully we've seen that. The American people have been standing up and demanding that courts and government respect their rights. And I'm just encouraged. I think we're going to see more of it in the future, that the American people are not going to take invasions of their liberty lying down, that we're going to keep it up in the fight for freedom. And it's great to be in the fight for freedom with you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And by all means, check out Liberty Justice Center. They do great work. And if you are listening to this and can attend on Cinco de Mayo, avoid drinking till the afternoon at least. Just kidding. But
happy May the 4th for now.
There you go. May the 4th right now. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.